Maria stretched her arms above her head, yawning as the morning sun streamed through the apartment window. The golden light filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:15 a.m. She had about 30 minutes before she needed to leave for work. Her tabby cat, Oliver, sat on the windowsill, his green eyes fixated on a pair of pigeons cooing outside. His tail flicked lazily, a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance at their presence. Maria smiled. "Don't even think about it," she warned playfully, ruffling his fur as she passed by. Oliver let out a soft chirp in response, stretching out his front paws. She had found Oliver 3 years ago, a tiny kitten shivering under a park bench on a rainy evening. He had been all bones and big eyes back then, his fur matted with dirt. She hadn't planned on taking him home, she wasn't even sure if she could take care of a pet, but the moment he had curled up in her lap, something inside her had shifted. From that night onward, Oliver had been hers. Now, he was strong and sleek, his once scrawny body filled out into the graceful frame of an adult cat. He had a habit of following her around the apartment, as if he needed to supervise everything she did. If she was cooking, he sat by the counter. If she was working at her desk, he sprawled across her papers. If she was watching TV, he claimed her lap as his personal throne. This morning was no different. As Maria sipped her coffee, Oliver leaped onto the table, knocking over a pen. He gave her an expectant look. "Oliver, you've had breakfast already," she said, but his unwavering stare told her he disagreed. Shaking her head, she scratched behind his ears before grabbing her coat and bag. "I'll be back soon," she told him, leaving the window slightly open. She often did this. Oliver liked to perch there and watch the world go by. She glanced back once before locking the door, smiling at the sight of him lounging in the sunlight. It was an ordinary morning. Maria had no idea it would be the last time she'd see him for 5 years. The day dragged on, a blur of emails and meetings. By the time she finally stepped off the bus and made her way home, the sky had deepened into a dusky orange. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the pavement. She reached her apartment, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Normally, Oliver would greet her instantly, rubbing against her legs, meowing in complaint about her long absence. But today, there was silence. Frowning, she set her bag down. "Oliver?" "Nothing." Her stomach tightened as she walked through the apartment. The bathroom, empty. The closet, empty. Under the bed, nothing. Panic began to rise in her chest. She rushed to the window, and her breath caught in her throat. It was wide open. Not just the slight gap she had left, but fully open. A cold gust of air rustled the curtains, and for a moment, she just stood there, her hands gripping the windowsill. The streets below were empty, save for the occasional passing car. He must have jumped out. Maria ran down the stairs, bursting onto the sidewalk. "Oliver," she called, her voice sharp with worry. She searched the small garden in front of her building, checked under parked cars, peered behind garbage bins. Nothing. Her heart pounded as she continued calling his name, circling the block, hoping for any sign of movement. A few neighbors glanced at her curiously, and she stopped a woman walking her dog. "Have you seen a tabby cat around here? Green eyes, about this big?" She gestured desperately. The woman shook her head. "Sorry, haven't seen any stray cats today." Maria's fingers curled into fists. This wasn't like Oliver. He wasn't a street cat, he had always been cautious, never straying too far from the building when she let him out on the patio. She kept searching until the sky turned dark and the streetlights buzzed faintly in the cool night air. By the time she returned home, exhaustion and dread weighed heavily on her shoulders. She barely slept that night, waking up every hour to check the window, hoping she'd hear the familiar scratch of paws against the door. But morning came and Oliver was still gone. The next few days were a blur of searching. Maria printed out flyers, each one bearing Oliver's picture and the words "Lost Cat, please help" in bold letters. She taped them to streetlights, pinned them to notice boards, slipped them into mailboxes. She checked the local shelters, called the vet clinics, posted in online groups. Strangers offered advice, but none of it brought her any closer to finding him. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt, only to sink when it was just another false alarm. I saw a tabby near 3rd Avenue. Turned out to be someone else's cat. There's a stray by the grocery store. Not Oliver. Days turned into weeks. The posters began to fade, their edges curling in the damp air. Maria's hope dimmed with them. She still checked the window every morning, still listened for a faint meow in the hallway. But deep down, she knew, he was gone. And the worst part? She had no idea where or why. Had he gotten lost? Had someone taken him in? Or had something else happened? She tortured herself with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. But no matter how much she searched, no matter how many times she called his name into the empty streets, Oliver never came home. Months passed. Then years. At first, the apartment felt unbearably empty. The silence was too loud, the spaces he used to occupy glaringly vacant. She found herself hesitating before closing the door, half expecting him to dart inside. She still cooked extra food by accident, still heard phantom purring in the quiet of the night. Eventually, the pain dulled, though it never fully faded. She stopped checking the window so often. The posters came down. Life moved forward. As it always did. But sometimes, just sometimes, she still dreamed of him. In her dreams, Oliver was always just out of reach, slipping through her fingers like mist. She would see him sitting in the distance, his green eyes glowing in the dark. She would call out to him, run toward him. And then, she would wake up. Alone. The years rolled by, and Oliver became a memory. A soft ache in the quiet corners of her heart. Until, one night, 5 years after he vanished. There was a soft scratching at the door. Maria stirred from sleep, her mind drifting in that hazy space between dreaming and waking. A sound had pulled her from the depths of slumber, something soft and insistent. She held her breath, listening. There it was again. A faint scratching at the door. She sat up abruptly, her heart hammering. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, this had happened before. She had woken up countless times, thinking she had heard Oliver's familiar pawing at the door, only to find nothing but silence. But this was different. The sound was real. Maria threw off the blanket, her pulse roaring in her ears. She crossed the darkened apartment in swift strides, her fingers trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated. This was impossible. Oliver had been gone for 5 years. She swallowed hard and pulled the door open. A gust of cold air swept into the apartment, carrying the scent of rain and earth. And there, sitting on the threshold, was a cat. A tabby cat. Maria's breath hitched in her throat. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. It couldn't be. The cat gazed up at her with luminous green eyes. Something deep inside her recognized them instantly. Oliver, she whispered. The cat let out a soft, familiar meow. Maria dropped to her knees, her vision blurring with tears. She reached out with a shaking hand, half expecting the cat to vanish, a figment of her desperate imagination. But when her fingers brushed against warm fur, she let out a choked gasp. It was real. He was real. Oliver, she sobbed, gathering him into her arms. He pressed his face against her neck, his purr vibrating through her chest like a forgotten lullaby. Maria clung to him, waves of emotion crashing over her, relief, disbelief, overwhelming joy. After 5 years, against all logic, Oliver had come home. She carried him inside, her hands unwilling to let go, afraid that if she did, he would disappear again. Placing him gently on the couch, she flicked on the lamp, her eyes drinking in every detail of him. His fur was slightly rougher than she remembered, marked with faint scars. His paws, once soft, were calloused as if he had traveled great distances. He smelled of earth, of wind, of something she couldn't quite place. But it was him. There was no doubt. "I thought you were gone forever," she whispered, stroking his head. Oliver blinked slowly, his eyes steady on hers. He made no move to explore the apartment, no frantic hunger for food or water, as if he had only been gone for a few hours rather than 5 years. Maria fetched his old food bowl, filling it with kibble. To her surprise, he ate slowly, methodically, instead of wolfing it down like a starving stray. Where had he been? Her mind swirled with questions. Had someone taken him in? Had he survived in the wild all these years? If so, how had he found his way back? She checked for a collar, nothing. His fur was clean but bore the marks of time. He was thinner. But not emaciated. He looked different. Wiser. Maria shook her head. She was being ridiculous. It was just her imagination running wild. "Let's get you to the vet tomorrow," she murmured, rubbing his ears. Oliver purred softly, but his eyes never left her face. That night, Maria expected to struggle with sleep, her mind racing with the impossible reality of his return. But as she lay in bed, Oliver curled up beside her just as he always had, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. The next morning, Maria took him to the vet, her nerves on edge. The receptionist gasped when she scanned Oliver's microchip. 5 years missing, the woman whispered. And he just came back? Maria nodded, gripping Oliver protectively. The vet examined him carefully, her brow furrowing. "He's in surprisingly good health," she said. "A bit underweight, but no major injuries." "It's remarkable, really. Where did you say he was all this time?" "I don't know," Maria admitted. "He just showed up at my door." The vet tapped her pen against the clipboard. "It's strange," she said. "His vitals are normal, but his behavior. He's extremely calm. Most lost cats, especially those gone for years, show signs of trauma, anxiety. But he seems composed." Maria glanced down at Oliver, who sat patiently on the exam table, his green eyes unblinking. "Almost like he knew he'd be coming home all along," the vet mused. Maria shivered. Over the next few days, Maria watched Oliver closely. He was the same in many ways. He still curled up beside her while she read, still followed her from room to room. But there were differences, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. He never meowed for food anymore, he simply tapped his paw against his bowl and waited. He no longer chased dust motes or played with string. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. And then there was the way he watched her. At night, she would wake to find him sitting by the window, staring at the sky. Not at passing birds or distant city lights, at the stars. It was unsettling. One evening, she tried to distract herself by watching TV. Oliver sat beside her, his tail curled neatly around his paws. The news played in the background, a segment about a recent meteor shower. Maria barely paid attention, until she noticed Oliver's ears twitch. His posture stiffened. His pupils dilated slightly. And then, he trilled. It wasn't a normal meow. It was low and melodic, unlike any sound he had ever made before. A chill ran down Maria's spine. She muted the TV. "Oliver?" He blinked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, as if nothing had happened, he stretched out and yawned. Maria swallowed hard. Something was different. The real turning point came a week later. She woke in the middle of the night, feeling a strange pressure in the air. She turned her head, and froze. Oliver was gone. The door was slightly ajar. Heart pounding, Maria bolted from the bed and ran outside. The street was deserted, bathed in moonlight. And there, in the middle of the road, sat Oliver. His gaze was locked on the sky. Maria followed his stare, and felt the breath leave her lungs. Above them, the sky shimmered. A faint, pulsing glow moved across the heavens. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a star. It was something else. A strange hum filled the air, so low it was almost imperceptible. Oliver let out a soft trill, his tail flicking once. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light vanished. Maria stumbled back, her heart racing. She looked at Oliver, who turned to face her with calm, knowing eyes. Her legs felt weak. What was that?" she whispered. Oliver blinked slowly, then padded toward her, rubbing against her leg as if reassuring her. She knelt beside him, her fingers tangling in his fur. He was warm, solid. Real. But something deep inside her told her the truth. Oliver had not just wandered off 5 years ago. He had been somewhere. And he had come back different. Maria's breath shuddered out of her. She had spent years mourning him, wondering if he had suffered, if he had been alone. But now, as she looked into those knowing green eyes, another terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if he had never been alone at all? The days after the strange encounter left Maria feeling like she was teetering on the edge of reality. Everything about Oliver's return was unsettling, but that night, when the sky had pulsed with an unearthly glow, had shattered her last grip on logical explanations. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it had been a drone, or a trick of light, or exhaustion playing with her senses. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't shake the feeling that Oliver had been responding to something. And it wasn't human. Maria decided she had to document Oliver's strange behaviors. She set up a notebook, jotting down every odd thing he did. Unusual stillness while watching the sky. Doesn't blink as often as before. Rarely vocalizes, but when he does, it sounds almost deliberate. No longer reacts to loud noises. Taps on electronic devices as if trying to interact with them. The last one disturbed her the most. She had always known Oliver to be a curious cat, but now, he seemed drawn to screens in a way that felt unnatural. He would sit in front of her phone or laptop, his paw hovering over the keyboard as if he were trying to type. One night, Maria decided to record him. She placed her phone on the table, camera facing Oliver as he sat on the couch. She expected him to do something minor, maybe twitch his ears or flick his tail. But what happened next sent ice crawling through her veins. Oliver looked directly at the camera. Not just glanced at it, looked into it. And then he raised a paw, and tapped the screen 3 times. Tap. 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 The phone screen flickered. Maria's breath caught. She snatched the phone and checked the footage. Her fingers trembled as she pressed play. At first, the recording was normal. Oliver sitting still, staring. Then, when he tapped the screen, the video glitched for exactly 3 seconds, static, a distorted blur of color. And then, a faint, indecipherable sound. It wasn't a meow. It wasn't static. It was a whisper. Maria dropped the phone onto the table as her entire body went cold. She knew she couldn't ignore this anymore. Something had happened to Oliver during those 5 years. Something unnatural. And he had brought it back with him. But what? Maria became obsessed with uncovering the truth. She spent hours online, searching for similar stories, cats disappearing and returning different, strange lights in the sky, unusual animal behavior. She stumbled upon a forum dedicated to missing pets and UFO sightings. At first, it seemed ridiculous. But as she scrolled through the posts, her stomach tightened. My dog was missing for 3 years. When he came back, he wouldn't bark anymore. He just stared at me. Sometimes at night, he makes strange sounds I've never heard before. My cat disappeared and returned a year later. She's normal, mostly, but she watches the stars at night. I swear, sometimes I catch her, humming. I don't know how to explain this, but my pet knows something. I feel like something is watching through them. Maria's fingers clenched around her phone. She wasn't alone. Others had experienced this. The thought made her skin crawl. She decided to take things further. She set up a camera in her apartment, placing it in the corner of her bedroom. She didn't tell anyone, this was something she needed to see for herself. The next morning, she checked the footage. For most of the night, nothing happened. And then, at 3:17 a.m., Oliver sat up from where he had been sleeping and walked toward the window. He sat perfectly still for exactly 5 minutes. Then, his head tilted, as if listening to something. And then, Maria's breath hitched, he stood on his hind legs. Just for a moment. And then the video glitched. When it returned to normal, Oliver was back on all fours, walking calmly back to bed. Maria slammed the laptop shut. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in sharp bursts. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a lost cat returning home. This was something else. The next few days, Maria found herself growing paranoid. She started waking up at odd hours, her skin tingling as if someone, or something, was watching her. She kept checking the windows, expecting to see those eerie lights in the sky again. And Oliver. Oliver was always there. Watching. Waiting. One night, Maria decided she needed answers. She turned on her phone's voice recorder and placed it next to Oliver as he sat by the window. Then, she whispered. "Where did you go?" Oliver blinked slowly. Her pulse pounded. "Who brought you back?" Silence. Then, a sound. Not a meow. Not a trill. A clicking noise. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a pattern. Maria's stomach twisted. This was not a normal cat sound. It was almost a response. She snatched her phone and played it back. The clicking sound was faint but clear. She uploaded the audio to an online sound analyzer, hoping it was just interference, maybe static. But when the program translated the sound into a waveform, her blood ran cold. It wasn't random noise. It was a sequence. 3 clicks. A pause. 3 more. Another pause. A pattern. Maria's hands were shaking. She knew what she was looking at. Morse code. A message. She stared at Oliver, who met her gaze calmly. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't her cat anymore. That night, she made a decision. She had to leave. Whatever Oliver had become, whatever had sent him back, it wasn't natural. Maria started packing a small bag, stuffing clothes and essentials inside. She didn't know where she would go, but she had to get away. As she zipped up the bag, she felt a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned. Oliver was sitting in the doorway. Watching. Maria's breath caught. His green eyes glowed. Not a reflection of light, they were glowing. A chill spread through her limbs. The apartment felt wrong, like the walls were closing in. The air was thick, humming with something unseen. And then, the lights flickered. A high-pitched ringing filled Maria's ears, making her stumble. Oliver stood up. On 2 legs. Maria screamed. And then, everything went dark. When she woke up, it was morning. She was lying on the couch, the sunlight streaming through the window. Her bag was gone. Her phone was on the table. And Oliver. Oliver was curled up beside her, purring softly. As if nothing had happened. But Maria remembered. She remembered the glowing eyes. The lights flickering. The darkness swallowing her whole. Her pulse was erratic as she reached for her phone with trembling hands. She opened the sound recording from last night. She pressed play. Silence. And then, a voice. Not hers. Not human. A distorted whisper. 3 words. She knows now. Maria dropped the phone. Her entire body was shaking. She turned to Oliver, dread sinking into her bones. He was watching her. Calm. Unblinking. As if waiting. Maria had always thought of herself as rational. Logical. A woman who believed in facts, not fantasy. But the past few weeks had shattered every assumption she had about the world, and about Oliver. She sat on the couch, staring at her phone, at the recording she had played 100 times already. She knows now. A voice that did not belong to her. A voice that did not belong to anyone she knew. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She could delete it, pretend none of this had happened, convince herself that exhaustion was playing tricks on her. But she knew better. She had to face the truth. Maria decided she needed help. She opened her laptop and returned to the forum where she had read about other missing pets behaving strangely. This time, she went deeper, searching for anything that could explain what had happened to Oliver. She found a thread titled, "They Come Back, but They're Different." The post described a man whose dog had vanished for years, only to return acting off. Just like Oliver. The man had tried to ignore the strange behavior, but over time, the dog seemed to know things. When the phone was about to ring, who was knocking at the door before they even arrived? Then, one night, he claimed he had heard whispers. Maria's stomach churned. This was too close to her own experience. She scrolled further and saw a reply from a user named Watcher013. It's not just animals. It's signals. Patterns. They use them like antennas. Her pulse quickened. She clicked on the profile. No other posts. No contact information. Just a single status message. The stars are listening. A shiver ran down her spine. Was she losing her mind? That night, she barely slept. Oliver lay beside her, still and silent. Too still. She had always found his presence comforting before, but now, every slow breath he took made her skin crawl. At exactly 3:17 a.m., she woke up. No sound had disturbed her. No nightmare had jolted her awake. She just knew. Maria turned her head. Oliver was awake. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at the window. His body was unnaturally rigid, his ears perked, his tail wrapped tightly around his paws. She swallowed hard. Oliver? He didn't respond. She followed his gaze, and her breath caught. Outside, the sky was moving. Not clouds. Not an airplane. Something else. A ripple in the darkness. A shape that didn't belong. Maria sat up slowly, her chest tightening. What is that? For the first time since he had returned, Oliver looked at her. Not like a pet. Not like a cat. Like something more. Maria's pulse roared in her ears. Oliver. And then? A sharp, electric hum filled the room. Her phone lit up on its own. The screen flickered, glitching. The lights in the apartment dimmed. And then? A voice. Not from her phone. Not from the outside. It was inside her head. We are here. Maria screamed. She scrambled out of bed, her hands shaking. The sound wasn't coming anywhere, it was just there, vibrating through her skull, through her bones. Oliver remained completely still, unblinking. The phone screen flashed symbols, letters, numbers, none of them making sense. Then, a pattern appeared. 3 symbols. A pause. 3 more. Another pause. Maria's breath hitched. It was the same sequence Oliver had tapped out on her phone days ago. The same Morse code. She had translated it before, but she hadn't understood it. Now, she did. It was a name. They are coming. A rush of static filled the air, making her ears ring. She clutched her head, her vision blurring. The world tilted. Shapes flickered in the corners of her eyes, shadows where there should be none. And then, Oliver spoke. Not in words. Not in a voice. In thought. You were not meant to see. Maria froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Oliver's green eyes locked onto hers. For the first time in her life, she truly felt small. You were not meant to know. Tears burned in her eyes. Her mind felt like it was splitting apart. Oliver, what are you? She whispered. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a messenger. Maria's body trembled. The hum in the air grew stronger. The walls of her apartment seemed thinner, like they weren't really there at all. She staggered back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sky outside was no longer dark. Something loomed beyond it, vast, endless, unknowable. A shape too large to comprehend. Maria squeezed her eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. But the voice came again. Soft. Unstoppable. You are awake now. A tear slipped down her cheek. I don't want this. Oliver blinked. And then, the world stopped. The next morning, Maria woke up in her bed. Her heart was pounding, but everything was normal. The lights were on. The sky was blue. Her phone sat on the nightstand, undisturbed. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it all. But then, she turned her head. Oliver was watching her. Her body tensed. He stretched, yawned, and hopped off the bed. Like a normal cat. Like nothing had happened. Maria sat up slowly, her mind spinning. Had she dreamed it? Had it all been a hallucination? She grabbed her phone, opened the voice recording app. The file was gone. No messages. No whispers. No evidence. It was as if none of it had ever happened. Except. She looked down at her wrist. A single, thin scar ran along her skin. It hadn't been there before. Her hands shook. Oliver meowed softly, curling up beside her. Like he always had. Like he always would. Maria swallowed hard. She didn't know where Oliver had gone. She didn't know who had sent him back. But she knew, beyond any doubt, she would never be alone again.